I've been meaning to make this video for a while now. Let me walk you through my process, simplified and perfect for beginners. We'll be using some unconventional tools and some conventional ones, but we'll rely less on rules and more on intuition. Let's go. Welcome back to my studio. This week we're going to incorporate some of the concepts that I've mentioned over the last few weeks, in particularly last week, using an abstract sort of foundation to build on something more representational. Some of you have asked me to do that. Fundamentally, every painting of mine starts off with a good structure. So a good foundation will inevitably result in a strong painting. It doesn't necessarily ensure a good painting, but having a poor foundation will almost always result in a poor painting in the end. So this week we're doing a more representational rendition of a landscape scene. What I have here again is a board that I've primed with acrylic gesso and a light acrylic wash of yellow ochre. I have deliberately drawn some of these lines as per a point that I will get to in a moment, that I've alluded to previously in previous videos, as to how I handle these lines and how I feel you should as well. So this week it's a landscape piece. I'm working off of a reference photo that I've got off of just a free photo sharing site. I'm not entirely certain if I can share it on here with you, but for this week's lesson, I'm not sure that it's all that pertinent to show it to you anyway. So I will hopefully show you a finished work up here somewhere. I'm narrating as I work here. I'm pretty optimistic that this will turn out pretty good, but you never know. It's always a surprise. So. Well, last few videos as well, this is the last point before we get started. Last few videos have always been using cold wax to a certain ratio. This week, as I said, some of the people have asked me to do a realistic scene, which I'm doing, but I will not be using cold wax, as some of you have asked as well. Cold wax, and I'll get to that as I'm working, is primarily used to, if you want to call it, deaden or matte your oil paint. It absorbs the oil and mats it, and it dries it quicker, so it allows you for much quicker layering in one session. Here, my oil paints have, the ones that I'm using, and I'll show you the palette in a second, are basically matted already. Some of them are older. I don't necessarily need to layer as much as, I don't necessarily need the luxury of having a cold wax for this particular scene, and I intend to push the values here, as today's video is not only about design but also about color, which I've done many videos about, but here I'll get to in a bit more detail. So let me show you the palette. So as you may guess, landscape colors in general have a tendency to be on a grayer side. Now, whenever you look at a landscape scene, you can, I guess, construe that a lot of the colors are full chroma. I'm working basically off of just a few colors. I've got radiant green up here, ivory black, over here in the top right there. You got, if I can point to it properly, ultramarine blue, and some warms over here, cad yellow, light, and raw sienna. And I've got a bit of cerulean blue and titanium white up here to shift the values. But all of the pre-mixed pools that I have here are on the grayer side. Okay, so I will be accessing these. I don't always do this, but for expediency reasons, I want to be able to access these pools quicker, and it will make it for a funner painting session. So let's start with the first marks. You can see here as I'm beginning to lay down the background that part of the reason I'm not using cold wax, as I've mentioned, is that this surface is quite absorbent as well. So a lot of the oil that's left is kind of skimming on this surface and being absorbed by it. And I'm also kind of able to layer over this quite quickly as well, create transparent layers that I'm used to making. Okay, so the lines that I've drawn in indicate obviously the horizon line, which is up here. It's about 67%, if you want to be exact, of the height of this substrate. It's based on a certain measurement. I'm not sure if it's more pleasing or less so if I'd increase the height or lower, but that's just where I put it. The lines that I've put in, however, do indicate the horizon line, but I also wanted to drive home a point. And I've mentioned this many times before. Maybe some of you didn't get my point. There's been some questions on it, in a sense that a lot of times what I see beginning painters do is they start off with a drawing. In this case, this is going to be a distant hill here. This is further out distant hills, and then some sort of indication of a field or a lake right up here. There's going to be some ice on there as well. So what I oftentimes see people do is they lay out a drawing of whatever, and then they start filling that drawing in. In this case, obviously, I'm using a broad spatula. It's usually a brush. They fill that section in, they fill that section in, they fill that section in, and then everything looks filled in and maybe somewhat formulaic. What I do often is lay down these lines, just some indications as to where I want the overall composition to be. In particular, if I'm doing a portrait, or if I'm getting a likeness, or if I'm, I don't know, creating a scene that requires a bit more attention to details. I'll lay down a drawing, but oftentimes what I'll do is, well, first of all, I'll use the proper tools. I'll get to that in a moment, but I'll go over the lines, okay? So I will continue building layers for, in this case, this hill, but I won't go right up to the line and make sure that the line's filled in and whatever else. I'll often just jump around and see how the composition reads as I'm building this background hill in this case. And the other thing that I often don't do is fill it all in, or have some sort of a process where I start filling something in. Oh, now I've filled that in, that's done. Let me go here and fill this in, that's finished, and now the sky's finished and everything's done. Everything needs to sort of breathe and come up together. Okay, so I won't fill this background hill in, or the water, or the foreground, or the background in its entirety. As I said, I will get this to much more of a realistic completion, so they will be rendering. But I like the whole painting to sort of come up, sort of work in mid-value range, and then towards the end push the values to the darkest and the lightest. Now the tools that I alluded to earlier that I will be using for this will vary, of course, just like to do for every video of mine, but just like in any other kind of, I don't know, even construction, you start with the broadest tool and you finish with the finest tool, if you will. So the foundation requires something broader, like this particular spatula knife. Now this isn't a large painting, but I do have this particular tool in a much broader and larger shape if it's something that's required. But you start with a broad tool like this, and you finish with something much more refined, like a silicone brush, which is somewhere around here. Oh, here it is. So I will be using these guys as well. Or maybe a fine brush. What you don't want to be doing at this initial stage is grabbing something this small, loading it with a little bit of paint. Again, a lot of people do this, and start, well, first of all, holding it like a pencil and then doing this sort of action and filling something in. Here you want initially something much more gestural. You want to obviously fill in this hole. It's not canvas, the substrate, and then get to get to strokes where you're making something much more refined like this towards the end. So in the beginning, you don't want this. You want to work with something broad like this, or even hand tools that are much larger like this, where you can apply paint in broader strokes. The tools that you use will obviously dictate the kind of mark that you can make. Now, even for something like this, that's obviously got a flat edge, it's beveled, however, on both sides, you can certainly do much more than just drag paint. You can also kind of remove paint, so it's much more of a transparent layer. You can also put it flat to the surface. Now, there's a lot of paint on here, so sort of bear with me, but it doesn't necessarily need to be just a straight beveled edge. You can still drag paint across and create these sort of marks that sort of like this, where they're much more surprising. This is when you got paint loaded on here, it's much more controlled of a stroke. You know where the beginning, where the end is. They also create very hard edges as well. If you don't want to do that, or you want to have it a bit varied, as I do, I introduce other tools, just so the whole painting doesn't look like it was painted with the same tool. So a brayer. So a brayer makes obviously different marks. You can fill out surfaces much quicker. So this, as I said, is an underpainting. In the front here, I will have some indications of snow on a lake. Okay, so knowing full limitations of your tools is very important, because you want to be able to be in control of your tools and not them be in control of you. Okay, we're done. Painting finished. Thank you for watching. Again, that's my attempt at humor. No, the underpainting is finished at this stage. So the intention for the underpainting, as is for every one of my paintings, is to lay down color in some sort of an interesting fashion, not, as I said earlier, filling in everywhere, allowing the underpainting or the underpainting to show through. A lot of that will of course be covered over as we paint, but some of it may not. But I want to have interest all over the place. At the same time, I want to have an idea of the design. As I said to you earlier, horizon lines up here, so these will be some distant hills. The values, as I said, will be pushed darker and lighter, and so on and so forth. But this gives me an indication of the overall no-tan underpainting that I talked about, the bones of the painting, and whether it works or not. So, as I said, the darkest darks will likely not be here, but will likely be here because of various reasons. Perspective, of course, is one of them. So this part here will read as the darkest darks. This will be the second or value up from that, or a couple values up. And then of course everything else will be a higher key. So the darkest part of the painting, or the dark of the painting, will have this section here and this section here. In a sense, about 2/3 of this painting will be the lightest, of course, the sky, and of course the snow, which is here. And the whole structure of the painting will be in some sort of an S-form design, if you will. So the eye will kind of lead from here up And I'm thinking this point may be the darkest dark here, leading into the horizon line in the background. The last thing with regards to the underpainting is you want to lay it down in as thin a fashion as possible. So indicating form, indicating shapes, indicating to an extent values, maybe not exactly, but for the most part everything has been laid down flat with thin color. There's no thicker applications. These hills have a bit of thicker application, but for the most part everything has been laid down thinly. So let's see what the second stage, which may in some sections be even the final stage, what that looks like now. So I'm trying to match color values much closer now than in the initial stage, and I've got a smaller tool. This is, I believe, a 2-inch, just a straight drywall putty knife that, as I said, the base layer is not dry, but it's been thinly applied. You can certainly come over it and not pull any of it, and leave marks similar to how a cold wax would leave with these broken color effects. Now I'm coming in, I'm holding this knife much flatter to the surface, parallel, so that more of the paint is transferred to the substrate. If I was holding it like this, or even at a higher angle, you would basically be dragging and removing paint. So I'm holding it here. I want more of the paint to be transferred and not remain on the knife. Now I'm much more delicate as well. You may notice that with my stroke. I'm holding it lightly. I'm not jumping around as much. As I said, I'm trying to get this painting to read relatively realistic. That doesn't mean that the strokes themselves can't be interesting. In fact, they have to be. Otherwise, the painting will not live up to my expectations. But I'm much tighter with my stroke. The second stage, or the second layer of paint that I usually apply, I reserve for, of course, refining edges, refining the drawing. In this case, there's a whole lot of interest. There's a whole lot of interesting marks. The sky has been the second layer has been applied to the sky as well. I want to keep things here relatively warm. I'm going to come in over with cooler blues towards the end, but I'm still working the same tool. And I think if you can, not necessarily reveal a secret, but if you can pin it down to one thing as to what makes an interesting painting, for me it's the tools that I use, or that you can use as well. You can kind of sum it up by saying the tools are an extension of your hand, or of course your arm, and the way that you apply these marks will directly dictate what's on your substrate. I'm still working in the medium value range. So I'm creating form with this snow. At this point, I'm going to refine this main edge, the one that I mentioned that will lead the eye into the horizon line back here. I'm referencing the photo, but certainly at this stage of the painting, I am deviating a great deal from it as well. So one of the advantages of using tools like this and not a brush, and you've probably heard me say this 1,000 times, is that you can wash it, you can clean it, wipe it, and get a clean stroke of whatever color value you want. You can go from basically darkest dark to a lightest light with subsequent marks. Yeah, this little piece of snow that I want to introduce here plays a vital role in dictating this form. So I want to make sure I get this shape right. By the way, I prefer holding my tools the way that these are designed, like this, much more so than a standard artist putty knife or palette knife like this, which you have a handle that has sort of like a step down that you need to apply, well, if you're going horizontally, of course, like this, but for the most part up and down and at a certain angle. I don't know why, but I prefer this design for this particular stage of the painting. I like these standard putty knives for other applications. So if I'm applying a certain batch of color that I need to place somewhere, because of the step down, I can come in and just apply that color there in this fashion and not create a hard edge, which these tools have a tendency to do. And then you can just sort of work it in. This is particularly pertinent for cold wax, so I'll hopefully do a demonstration either next week or following week where that exact thing you use at various stages of painting, where you're applying, instead of dragging, you're dabbing color on. Let me make sure I load this palette knife properly. There's not much paint, but you're dragging paint on and you're dabbing it on, as opposed to applying a whole lot of it. And then you can of course knock it back if you need to. In this case, this is not supposed to be here at all, so let me get rid of it. As I've said many times before, I think one of the most daunting things about painting with oils is this inability to control them, in that, you know, people come in, students mostly, they come in, they apply thick paint, and they get to what would amount to essentially mud very quickly within a painting session. But if you keep your layers of paint thinner, certainly in the initial stage, but even in subsequent stages, you can always come in. We're at about, let's say, 2 hours into this painting today. You know, you got obviously the base layer here, one layer here, another layer has been applied thinly over that, this darker part. I'm coming now in, for example, with this warmer Cad Red raw sienna combination that I can kind of skim it across the surface and have it pick up and stay there, as opposed to muddying up the whole painting. Now it is creating a whole lot of broken color, which at this stage I'm okay with. Well, a lot of times I'm okay with it to stay there for good, but you can always knock that back. But as you can see here, the marks that I'm making are both interesting to me, and this layer is not activating the bottom layer, in a sense that, you know, I'm putting in a brown versus a black, it's not mixing. I mean, you can certainly do that, but I'm leaving it just like that. So I've created 3-4 layers, no cold wax, no medium whatsoever, just straight paint, just by applying color in a thinner fashion as opposed to coming in too thickly initially. Okay, so I think this is as good a time as any to talk about my approach to color when it comes to pieces like this. So, as I hope the theme of this video is, don't be constricted by both the drawing, the conceptual idea. Always feel free to deviate from your idea and let the process sort of dictate where it wants to take you. With respects to color, it's somewhat similar, but in ways different as well. So what I mean by that is, let's take a look at this snow. So indication of snow on this lake. It's supposed to read as white. By all accounts, snow is white. Of course, it matters what kind of light falls on it. And then you've got shadows, you've got troughs, you've got valleys in the snow, you've got all sorts of different nuances of white, quote unquote white, if you look at it really carefully. So beyond what your eyes might see, and I've definitely alluded to this concept in my previous videos. In fact, a lot of you subscribed to my channel simply because of the way that I apply color, particularly the portraiture, the earlier ones that I've put out. The way that I see color is, of course, based on temperature, the local color as well. So again, if you look at this snow, I feel that it's warm. So instead of coming in with, like, let's say a warm blue, I might come in with this warm green. And now, of course, I'm paying attention to the reference photo, but less so at this point. I'm looking at more of the design and how everything's flowing. So I might come in with this warm light green blue. I'm using my squeegee tool because it's easier to clean, as I mentioned before. I might apply that there, and then I might say, you know what, I see maybe even a warm grayish blue, not so green anymore. So I might come in with that color. Therefore, sort of creating this kaleidoscope of different values of white, all on the warmer side, because I'm feeling that this snow is warmer than cooler, certainly in this highlighted section here. By the way, at this stage of the painting, I'm coming in with the final color values. In fact, let's see what this other warm white might do for us. This is almost like a warm gray. All staying within the similar, I mean this blue kind of deviated a little bit, but within the same value structure of warm greens, warm reds, warm blues, thus creating interest in this area as opposed to just putting in a white or an off-white, one plain color. Again, everything is built up from the ground up. First you got the broad strokes, and then you got the less broad or smaller strokes. And now you can come in with either a brush, or I'm using the silicone tool to build up final layers which are precise to the drawing as far as color values, but also much thicker and impasto. You know, there's a famous quote by a famed Spanish impressionist artist, Joaquin Sorolla, when he said, "With all its excesses, the modern impressionistic movement has given us one discovery, the color violet. It is the only discovery of importance in the art world since Velázquez." So I figured, why not add a bit of violet to our snow? Again, keeping it within the same family of warm colors and within the same value range as our previous warm green, light, and grays and blue. So the snow is defined by just warmth and light, violet, greens, blues, and reds. Okay, now we fast forward by about an hour, hour and a half, where I've basically put down the final color values across the whole surface. There's this approach that I usually take where you build up interest as you go, leaving a whole lot of broken color and interesting shapes along the way. However, it is almost always the case that when I get to the end, I have to subtract or delete certain interest, if you want to call it, quote unquote. What I've done is I've added some interest in the background as well. Interestingly enough, the reference photo didn't have any kind of indication of sunlight. It was just a frozen lake at dusk. But I felt that this little piece back here was warranted, so it indicated some sort of a sunset over those hills. But as I mentioned, usually at the end of every painting session, I have to get to a point where there's too much interest, there's too much information, and I start subtracting. So I'll start with this guy, and what I mean by subtracting is that I want to unify certain planes. So you've got a sky plane or a higher key plane, along with the snow, which has received a whole lot of definition. I'll show you that when I zoom in. And of course, the darker notes. This is very simplistic in design, as I mentioned in the beginning. So what I'll do just ever so slightly is use this fan brush to sort of very delicately block some of these edges and create less hard edges in the background where I don't want the eye to linger for too long. At the same time, you don't want to go at it too harshly or too hard to create mud. You still want to have some indications of the layers that we put. And as you can see, I certainly hope you can see, the yellow underpainting is permeating through in the background, in the clouds, of course, in the foreground and the background. So I'm going to continue doing this for a while and likely leave this guy overnight and examine tomorrow. But today's painting session, about 5 hours or so, maybe a little bit less actually, when you consider I took a few breaks along the way. I'm quite happy. This, in fact, is quite inspired by my trip to Croatia, as it seems like all these paintings going forward are going to be. Whether from memory, whether from certain colors, of course, the azure blues and just some of the sienna colors. But of course, as I said, this is a reference photo that's entirely different. So I used a lot of the colors from memory and from what I mixed, as opposed to the local color in the photo. The photo was, in fact, edited quite a lot. Okay, so day 2. Painting is, for the most part, I think, complete. So really all I did today was add this component down here, as it kind of, I guess, improved the overall shape, as the way this lake sort of leads into the horizon line, into this sunset that I've added on. I should say that because I was using only oils and not any mediums, there's a bit of glare, as you can see up here in the sky. I apologize for that. It's a bit more difficult to photograph in video, but for the most part, I'm quite happy with this piece. Wasn't sure what's going to come of it, but ultimately, I think this is a great example of how a strong foundation can lead and create your representational, highly representational work. Like, for example, my piece here, which is obviously a landscape, but in reality, all it really is, it's got this negative shape here, which is the dark and the line across, and then everything else is high key. In the end, I ended up tightening the drawing quite a bit, not as abstract as some of the other pieces that I've put out here, but as I said, I'm quite happy. And I'm gonna come in close now, firstly to sort of get rid of this glare and show you all the broken colors, the individual notes of colors, I call them, that make up this landscape, starting with the sky. And as you can see, there's a whole lot of marks that we've created with those broad spatula tools, the drywall putty, the regular artist putty knives, and of course that snow I talked about. You can see up close quite clearly all the little individual notes of color, greens, purples, warm yellows, and of course the blues, and all the other marks that we've created that make up the overall shape of this painting. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next week. Let me know what you think of this design and the overall concept. I am keen on hearing your thought. I think next week we're going to try to see if we can do either a figurative work using similar concepts, or going in an entirely different direction and doing something totally abstract, following this exact formula but keeping things entirely abstract. I'm not quite sure yet, but do come back for that. Have a wonderful day.